Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Wendy Davis. Thank you again. Lovely to have you here. I appreciate it. May I put you over there? Sure. Senator,
Evan.
hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
So you're going to do this? Well, I read Politico and the AP. They say you're going to do this. You're going to do this.
I'm going to announce on Thursday what I'm going to do.
Right. Are you going to tell us you're Batman? I mean, what are you announcing? You're going to announce your plans, right?
I'm going to announce.
That's my plans. And early on, you said a couple months ago, either running for governor or state senate. So even if you can't tell us what we all think we know now, still it's going to be one or the other.
Or the other.
One or the other. You didn't correct those reports at the end of last week. You didn't confirm them, but you didn't correct them.
I neither confirm nor deny.
Nor deny anything like that.
Abounding.
Can you give us a couple of seconds just into the calculation that went through your mind the last couple of months in the run-up to whatever the decision is? What were you thinking about as you ultimately made a decision?
Well, obviously, when you think about doing something this big, and that may seem improbable, you want to make sure that you're not doing something foolhardy.
Yep.
When I ran for my Senate district when I first made that decision in 2007 and began that race for the 2008 election, I spent a lot of time with people who understood how to define whether a path exists. And I knew when I entered that race that it would be hard, but I knew it was possible. And because of that, I knew when I asked people to support me and to help me through their time, their energy, their financial resources, I knew I was asking them to partner with me to do something that I believed we could make happen.
Yep.
And I have gone through that same analysis in making the decision that I'll be announcing on Thursday.
On Thursday. You've alluded to the improbability of it. The numbers in the state have been the numbers, but obviously that's a calculation that any candidate for office as a Democrat these days makes. You run not because of the numbers, you run despite the numbers.
Indeed.
Indeed. I want to ask you about the filibuster as a catapult for your celebrity. I imagine that as a celebrity now, you are taking the good and the bad together. Anybody who finds themselves thrust into the spotlight is forced to take a lot of stuff that maybe they don't want, the bad with the good. What's it been like? What has it been like these last couple of months? You've lost your privacy, I suspect.
In some respects, but I tell you, Evan, the thing that's been most striking to me about it, and I've been traveling around the state a lot. I've been outside the state a bit, and I'm so struck by young women who come up to me, many of them with tears in their eyes, some of them who don't even say a word. They just hug me, and the expression on their face says so much. What I'm struck by is that somehow that day tapped into what was a feeling for many young women that they weren't being heard. And it's been remarkable to see their reaction to that. And it's been humbling to have been privileged to play a role in making that happen.
Yeah. That is going to be, I suspect, whatever, again, you make your announcement on Thursday, this idea that women's voices are not being heard in Texas. Senator Van de Putte articulated that specifically on that evening, but thematically, as you go forward, you could imagine a scenario where that becomes the basis for a conversation with the state. Are women's voices being heard? Are women being treated the way they should be?
Yes, I can thematically imagine that as a conversation, and I can thematically imagine a broader conversation too in Texas about whether people, just folks who are working every day, taking care of their kids, trying to make ends meet, whether they feel like they're being heard in Texas. I don't think it's unique to gender. I do think we have some real issues where Texans feel like the folks who have been representing them in leadership positions in Austin aren't reflecting the things that they and their families value and care most deeply about.
Okay. I have to ask you about the haters for a second, and then we're going to move into very quickly a conversation about issues, because I think it's important for people, again, whatever your decision, people understand what you think about the big, broad issues that affect Texans. But I want to ask you about the haters. You are, for all practical purposes now, a walking effigy. Every time you go on Twitter, every time you talk to people out in the world, you hear the most extraordinary and awful things. You've heard abortion Barbie on down. How do you deal with that? How do you personally process it, and how do you deal with it publicly? How do you maintain yourself, and how do you steel yourself for what you surely know is coming? If it's bad now, it's apt to get a whole lot worse.
I've been through a lot of tough fights in my life, Evan, and I've learned to weather them. I've been in political office, and as you know, I fought for my seat twice really hard. I fought a very difficult redistricting battle that everyone said we could not succeed in, and we did. And I've leathered up a little bit over that, for sure. Yeah. But I just try to keep in my heart and at the forefront of my mind what it is that I'm working on. Yep. And remind myself that I truly believe in the things and the people that I stand for, and that I am capable of withstanding all kinds of heat, all kinds of nastiness, in order to try to deliver what I think is an important message for people who feel like they're not being heard.
They will attempt to litigate this entire election, you know, on about one issue, abortion. They will say this is whoever their candidate is versus the woman who was at the center of the abortion fight. They're going to try to make this entirely about that. You think that the campaign can transcend that?
If there were going to be a statewide campaign.
If there were. See what I did there? I actually thought, you know, if there were going to be one, you think it could, conditional tense, past participle, perfect, but you think it could be, it could transcend that one.
Well, look, I think Texans, when you talk to them about what they're thinking about, these issues, these divisive issues that keep getting thrown into the middle of a room where legislators go into their corners and come out with their boxing gloves on, those aren't the things that Texans want to hear us talking about. What they care about is public education. Is their child getting a good education? Yeah. Can their child go to college? Is there a path for their child's future? Is there a path for them to have a good job? Are they going to have adequate health care? These are things that really matter to people. Are we creating the kind of climate to keep a healthy workforce and a vibrant economy? That's what people care about. And that's what they want their leaders to be in the business of talking about. Right. So I think that we're going to see, if there were a statewide campaign, we'll see that the expression of that come out in many, many ways.
Okay. Well, let's talk about education, since you mentioned it. People forget, short-term memory in the state of Texas. Before there was this filibuster, there was that filibuster, right? You actually have been at this before. At the end of the 2011 legislative session, education was the focus of your last extended period of talking, right? Yeah. You were concerned about the cuts to public education. That's an issue that is important to you.
Very.
Yeah. Oh, how are we doing? You know, we cut all that money out of public education last time. People still fight over exactly how much it was, $4 billion, $5.4 billion, whatever it was. A lot was put back in this last time, $3.5 billion or so, plus a little bit more kind of over the shoulder. Problem solved, or do we still have more work to do?
Well, certainly not problem solved. And of course, Judge Dietz is going to be taking up the litigation that 600 school districts across Texas are involved in, again in January. And it would be very interesting to hear his perspective on how well we did.
Well, he declined to stop the progress of the suit, as some hoped he would, because you all put more money back in. So that tells you he was not totally impressed by what the legislature did.
Indeed. Yeah. And you know what he said in his original opinion, finding in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts that they had asked him to consider, was that the underfunding of public schools in Texas was about a $10 to $11 billion number.
Annually.
That's right.
Right, yeah.
We got back, $3.4 billion over the biennium in this last legislative session. But we know, I certainly feel strongly, that there are so many places where we can be doing better, and we failed to do that. When we started the budget, when it first rolled out onto the Senate floor, as you recall, Evan, it only restored $1.5 billion toward those funding cuts. And I was one of only 2 people who voted against the budget that day. Then we fought like hell for the rest of the session. As a good bipartisan working group should, different perspectives came to the table, and there was a good push and pull, which is the natural consequence of a healthy democracy, and we added $3.5 billion total back. It's not nearly enough. Yeah. And what we know are that programs that were helping kids who really need a little leg up in the public education arena have been dramatically underfunded, and we're going to see the consequence of that. And if we don't start thinking more responsibly about investing in our most important investment we can make, our human capital, we're going to see the impact of that in our economy. I know you had Steve Murdoch here.
We did.
Talking during TribuneFest, and he had some really good.
Well, the numbers are stark in terms of the demographic change that's not just coming, but is here.
That's right.
And the open question is, to what degree are we changing our thinking about budgeting and policy to meet that head on? But I want to go back and ask on this question of funding. You know, this has been a problem for how long? We seem to go through this cycle of it's not constitutional the way we fund public schools, then we come back and we come up with a solution. It's a little bit held together with spit and chewing gum, and then we find that it's not constitutional again and then go back. We can put a man on the moon, I can pause live television, but we can't figure out how to fix the finance system of public. Why is it so hard? Why can't we get it right finally and have it stick?
Well, it shouldn't be so hard. And I think there's a backdrop, of course, of many members in our legislature who are worrying more about the report card grade that they're getting.
Scorecards.
Their scorecards.
Yeah.
Primary elections that they may face, and the consequences of standing up and doing the right thing on behalf of the school children of Texas. And that's a shame that we've gotten to a place where those perspectives have become more influential than looking down the long-term road of Texas and understanding that if we fail to come together and do the right things for public education and higher education, yeah, this wonderful story that we tell about the health and vibrancy of the Texas economy is likely to begin to crumble. And that's something that we all need to care about. Even if you don't care about an individual child who may be having a hard time in school and that this particular program might be helpful to them, if all you care about is the self-interest of making sure that our economy is strong and that we have a workforce that's trained to support that economy, then you ought to be interested in investing in public education.
But aren't, Senator, you understand there are basically competing worldviews right now in the state of Texas. One says we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem, right? We had some colleagues, in fact, from the Fort Worth delegation on the House side up here yesterday in a panel of Tea Party leaders who said, you know, we spent 26% more than we did the previous time. You know, we're spending way too much money, we're spending ourselves into oblivion, and you know, we're not spending on the right things. One worldview, and the governor articulated it when he came back from the presidential campaign trail, is we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. But the alternate worldview is we don't have a spending problem, we have a failure to invest problem. How do you bring those two sides, which seem to see the world so differently, together? How do you persuade those people who say we have a spending problem that you have to
Well, I
invest?
think in large part it starts with an honest understanding of the resources that we have available to us. And I know you recall, Evan, that when we closed out that 2011 legislative session, it was with a comptroller's estimate about what our revenues would be that turned out to be sorely.
Right, how'd that work out for us? Not so well.
Not so well.
Yeah.
And we actually had $8.8 billion more available to us than her revenue estimate indicated. And
right,
of course, people can err. I mean, no, it's not a perfect
right,
science.
But that's not a margin of error mistake.
It's a huge,
$8.8 billion
error.
is a lot. Right?
And you know, the real skeptics might think that in part things like that are purposeful, that it's part of helping to constrain and choke down our investment in the future of
Are you
Texas.
one of those who believes that there was a conspiracy to spend less money by misreporting to the legislature how much we had available?
I believe that she could have done a much better job of estimating where we were. And that had we known, I would like to think that the legislature would have made a decision not to make the cuts that were made.
In fact, some of your colleagues have said as much, that if they only knew back then
right.
how much they had to spend, they wouldn't have cut public education as much.
That's right.
Right.
And we need to connect with our community and hear their priorities in terms
Yeah.
of how they want to see us solve this problem. So, for example, we have resources in the rainy day fund. We did, of course, I think, make some significant progress in this past session, asking that our voters give us their perspective on investing some of those resources in water infrastructure.
Right. Remains to be seen whether they'll do it.
It does.
But
But
we'll
I think it's important that we're at least putting that question out there.
Yep.
And I think we need to have more of that town hall community input to what we're doing at the state level. It's one of the things that I learned in local government. As you know, I served on the city council in Fort Worth for 9 years. And bringing people together, listening to what their concerns were, what their priorities were, bringing diverse perspectives together at a
Right.
table, and listening and looking down the road toward how we try to bring those perspectives to a place where they could agree, and then leading toward a solution that was an outcome that both sides bought into, was part and parcel of local government. And I loved it. And what I loved about it was that we were able to work together without anyone getting bogged down into what the party label next to their name said they ought to be doing.
Right.
And I'd like to see us returning more to that kind of conversation in the state of Texas, and I think most people would like to see.
But of course, the alternate view of that, Senator, is that, well, go ahead, do your thing. That's fine. The alternate view of that, Senator, is that the thing we hate most in the world is California. And California governs by initiative and referendum, by and large. And there are some people who believe that the legislature actually made a bad decision to kick the water and transportation funding to the voters, that we send you all to Austin to make those hard calls for us. And you make those hard calls on other issues, why kick this to the voters on water and transportation? And for that matter, on education, why feel the need to go home and ask the voters' permission to lead? That's what we send you there to do, lead.
You're making an excellent point, and I agree with you. And I want to make clear that I'm not suggesting that we lead through referendum and that we have a vote on every decision that we make. When people elect us, they elect us, and we hope we're bringing their perspective to the table. I've tried very hard to do that, and I know colleagues of mine on both sides of the party aisle do the same.
Yep.
But unfortunately, when we get to that Capitol, many become way too far removed from the people that they're representing, the voices of the people who elected them, and the perspectives and the concerns that they have.
You sound like Ted Cruz.
And instead, well, you know, we agree on some things. But instead...
They now have their headline, actually. That's good. That's good.
And see, we shouldn't be afraid to say things like that in politics. But instead, of course, what happens in that environment is there's a handful of people that have influence over decision-making that's really not reflective of Texans as a whole. And I think a lot of legislators saw that after those budget cuts in 2011. They went home and they were told in no uncertain terms that that scorecard that they were worried about is not what matters. What matters are the impacts to the families that they represent back home.
Right.
And they heard from their parents, they heard from their teachers, they heard from school administrators all over the state about the impacts that those cuts were having in their day-to-day lives. And that's why we saw, I believe, when we came back in this last legislative session, we saw an approach that was different than that. We did see a much more unified approach toward trying to find a way to restore those cuts.
It was kind of a bipartisan issue, actually. But it was more of a bipartisan issue than most at the Capitol. Do you believe that we have enough revenue in this state to meet all of our needs, not just on education, but across the board?
I believe that we do. But I believe we have to really sit back and be thoughtful and smart about how we make our revenue and spending decisions. And a huge piece of that, of course, is the exemptions that we give in the state of Texas today. I was very supportive of, I think I signed on to the bill that Senator Corona and Senator Ellis, a Republican and a Democrat, in a bipartisan way, sponsored this last legislative session, asking us to take a serious look, a sunset review type of a look, looking at the $35+ billion every biennium that we give up in loopholes and exemptions. Setting aside, of course, property tax exemptions, which I think are uniformly supported, but these other exemptions that exist in the state of Texas, and to ask whether they still make sense. When I was on the city council in Fort Worth, I chaired the Economic Development Committee for many years, and we were awfully good in Fort Worth, I think, one of the best at making sure that when we were giving tax dollars toward helping make something happen, helping to create growth in our economy and helping to add jobs, we were very good at the but-for test. But for our participation, would this investment occur? And then after we answered that question, we were exceedingly good at oversight and making sure that the promises that were made with regard to the investment that would be delivered, with regard to the jobs that would be delivered, were actually realized. And if they weren't, we took our tax dollars back. And the state of Texas, as big and grand as we are, and as wonderful a job as we've been doing in growing our economy, there are improvements that could be made in terms of the way we make those decisions and demonstrate that we can be more responsible with our taxpayer dollars while still being a very good and healthy, vibrant partner in keeping our economy growing and our jobs growing. I was really pleased this session to successfully pass, for the first time since its creation, an audit of the Texas Enterprise Fund. It seems illogical that we had not done that before. But those kinds of conversations, I think, are terribly important. And we've got to look at our existing stable of revenue before we even begin to talk about whether more is needed.
Are there any specific exemptions you want to cite as an example of something? You mentioned auditing the TIF now, but I'm talking about, is there a specific exemption in that $35 billion that you would say, again, were there a statewide race, were there a new governor, you would say this is an example of the kind of thing that maybe has run its course and we ought to take it back?
I really don't feel like I can say that, because what we need instead is a uniform look, a very objective look with the input of the Legislative Budget Board, the comptroller, the legislature, making those determinations and receiving, of course, the input from our chambers of commerce and other business partners in Texas to make sure that we're making good decisions in any changes that we would make.
You say we shouldn't be looking at new revenue sources until we make sure that the money we have now is being spent properly on education and other issues. You know that during the session there was discussion, as we talked about, of water and transportation and whether we have adequate funds to put toward each of those very important things for the state. And we're at a point now where even Republicans are proposing new revenue sources on transportation. Senator Williams, Senator Eltife, others are talking about that. Are you prepared, whether or not you run, to say we should not be that we should not be raising taxes in this state to put more money in the budget to pay for education or any of these other programs? Will you take a tax increase off the table for those kinds of things?
I would certainly take a sales tax, a property tax increase off the table, absolutely. And would, you know, if I had one day, someday, the privilege of being in a leadership position that could veto legislation like that, I would. But, you know, I think there have been some very important conversations about that and some good ideas put on the table. I think, you know, I supported a bill that came out of the Transportation Committee a couple of sessions ago. Again, not to want to lead by referendum, but it was certainly the best solution within this legislative environment that would have asked our voters whether they wanted to increase certain fees. Their vehicle registration fee, as an example, in exchange for improving our transportation infrastructure. We're, of course, hearing right now that TxDOT is talking about turning some of our roads back to gravel. And for anyone who cares about the health and vibrancy of our economy, we know we cannot turn our roads back to gravel.
Well, the optics are bad at a minimum, right?
Indeed. And
yeah.
you know, think about rural Texas. I mean, forget the challenges that we have in some of our urban areas, but in rural Texas, the farm to market roads, the investment in those, they grew our economy. They truly did. They made Texas what Texas became. And there were leaders at one time that were willing to talk about making those kinds of investments so that all of Texas could play a role in our healthy, strong economy and be a beneficiary of it. And we've not really been having those conversations lately, and it's time for us to have them again.
Let me move from public ed to higher ed. We're sitting on a campus that has been at the center of a debate over what kind of reforms should come to the higher ed policy arena. And you hear on this campus and elsewhere about funding of higher education dropping precipitously over this last generation, to the point that some say, are we out of compliance with the constitutional promise of a university of the first class? Not just here, but across the public university systems. Are we putting enough money into public education, or into public higher education, to the public universities? What do we do about that? When you look at the rank order of priorities in the unrestricted portion of the budget, people typically go, according to the polls, public ed, healthcare, higher ed. Higher ed always finishes third of three. So from the state's perspective, what should we be doing with higher ed that we're not now doing, and where's the money going to come from?
Yeah, excellent questions. I'll start by talking about my own personal experience in Texas. Started at Tarrant County College, on to TCU. All of that was made possible because of the climate of investment in higher education that was going on in Texas at the time. And I had a path that made education affordable to me in spite of the fact that I came from a background of poverty. There are a lot of families right now who want so much for their children to have those same opportunities, and they just don't. And it's not just hitting people in the very low income brackets where I was. It's hitting people in middle income families. Sometimes they're sort of in the damned if you do, damned if you don't situation because they can't qualify for maybe the same kind of financial aid. Financial aid has been constrained at the state level and at the federal level. It's a problem in both places. But if we don't invest in making those possibilities, the hope, the promise of a future like that available to young Texans who want it, we will pay the price down the road. There's no question we'll pay the price.
And of course, with the change in the population, again, not coming but here, we're going to have a whole lot more people who may be first in their family.
That's right.
Or first in their community even to go to college, and what kind of protections as a legislature or as a state do we need to be putting in place so that they have a pipeline to get into, whether it's a traditional four-year school, two-year situation, community college, or even a technical school? Are we doing enough in that respect?
Part of it is making sure, and I think Texas is doing some incredible things in this arena, making sure that we're maximizing the overlap between what's happening in the high school classroom and the college classroom. Right. And so we're seeing more and more of our independent school districts offering those dual credit classes.
Yeah, the high school to college.
That's right. And kids are getting basically a free, in some instances literally, 2 years of college credits before they ever graduate from high school.
Right. You're for this. You think this is a good thing.
I'm completely for that. Yeah. And it's an innovative way of making higher ed possible without having to think about where's the money going to come from.
I guess let me come back, though, on the money thing. Should we be putting more money into higher ed? Should we be figuring out a way in the budget to put more money toward the public universities? And if so, where would it come from, since you've said you think we may have enough revenue in the budget as is?
In 2003, the tuition in Texas was, of course, deregulated.
Right.
And that was done during a tough budget year.
Yeah.
The legislature had a decision to make. Should it continue to grow its investment in higher ed, or should it instead allow our universities to charge higher tuitions in order to make up the revenues that they needed? And we all know what the impact of that has been. I think from that period, the tuition has doubled, if not even more than doubled, in our university system.
Right. Still a bargain by a lot of people's standards.
Indeed, indeed.
Right.
But certainly priced for many families the opportunity to go out of their abilities. And I think we have to really be thinking about that. There have been some responses in the last couple of legislative sessions, which I've supported, asking that if a student enters college, that for the entire 4 years that they're there, their tuition won't go up. They'll at least have the guarantee of a tuition freeze for their 4-year period.
That's a Governor Perry
a
plank, right?
Yes,
he's for that, I think.
Very good
Predictability
idea.
Of tuition.
Indeed, it's a very good idea. But the state, I think, is going to have to consider that while those tuition levels have risen as they have, the fact that our ability to help in the financial aid arena has declined means that we're pricing people out of the opportunity to grow through a college education.
Yep.
And everyone deserves that if they want it.
So would you be for re-regulating tuition?
If the state can pull its responsibility load forward and make that happen. Obviously, what we don't want are for our universities to suffer because they're suddenly being choked and don't have enough resources to do what they need to do.
And that's after they've been able to raise their tuition. They don't have enough resources.
Exactly.
Right.
So, I mean, if the state were going to say, we're going to go back into a situation of regulating tuition, obviously it would need to be in a position of stepping up to the plate and helping to make colleges whole for that.
You alluded earlier to the health of the Texas economy and the relationship between education, public and higher, to the workforce and to the good economy. You know, the governor, once on the presidential campaign trail and potentially again, brags a lot about the Texas miracle. You know, more jobs created in the last 13 years while he's been in office than all 49 states combined. Some period of time, looking back 3-4 years, we're responsible for 8 to 8.5% of the population growth in the country, but 40% of the job growth. Now, you can take any statistic and turn it upside down. The underbelly is never attractive, right? But does the governor have a point? I mean, the economy has been in this state pretty good, and if it were bad, he'd get to blame whether he deserves it. So he gets the credit whether he deserves it for being the guy in charge.
Well, indeed, indeed. I don't think it's unfair for him to be proud of and to be bragging about the impact that he and others have had in Texas, but it's certainly been a group effort. But I do think that part of that story that's not being told is that right now Texas stands 49th out of 51 states in what it's investing in per pupil education. I say 51 states because
including DC, that's right. We're down from 41st before the 11th session to 49th out of 51 in per pupil spending on public ed. That is true.
And so you can't simultaneously, I think, brag about the healthy economy that you have and compare it to the country as a whole. That's a fair thing to do. But then simultaneously not own the fact that in spite of your healthy economy, you're not investing in the future of what your state can and should be. And you're not investing in the future potential of the individuals that you represent in Texas.
But don't people, Senator, don't people come here with their eyes open? You hear a lot about low tax, low service state. Get what you pay for what you get. People come here knowing that they have low taxes. That's one of the things we brag about. But the thing that accompanies that is low services. Molly Ivins used to say we're Mississippi with better roads, right? I'm not sure that we're not just Mississippi now, actually. That's right, yeah. But you understand this, that the idea of Texas not providing very much in the way of social services is not a new concept. It's ever thus, and it potentially would be ever thus, given the decision to make low taxes a priority.
I'm not talking about social services. I'm talking about public education.
So you put that in a different category entirely, investment spending on social infrastructure. So.
I do, because, well, first of all, it's the only thing constitutionally we're required to fund as a state legislature. And it obviously is and has the most tremendous impact in terms of the future health of our economy.
Right.
We, of course, in the Public Ed Committee, although I was not on public ed this session, I did attend almost all of the public education committee hearings. And we heard a great deal from employers around this state. The Chemical Council kind of led the charge for that. I believe his name was Hector Rivera, the person who was the spokesperson. But he was speaking on behalf of 300 different industry sectors in Texas saying, we don't have the workforce here that we need. And if you don't do something about educating out of the high school system and into the technical and vocational arena, people who can satisfy our need for workers, either will leave or we'll bring new people in from out of state. And what that will mean to the people who grew up and whose families paid taxes here and went through our education system here is that they won't have the ability to benefit from the economy that they should have the ability to benefit from. And I think that his testimony and that of chambers of commerce all over the state through this last legislative session played a significant role in the legislature coming together in a bipartisan way and trying to make some improvements. And I hope and expect that they'll continue to do that because their voices are truly the voices that understand more than anyone what the failure to invest in education is going to.
You know, the governor has spent a lot of time out. A governor's role, you may conditionally one day find this out. The governor spends a lot of time outside the state, our current governor, luring companies away from other states to come to Texas. One wonders if the education issue, as water and transportation apparently have become an impediment at some point to those businesses coming here. They're beginning to ask, the governor's even said this, do you have adequate water, do you have adequate roads going forward? And that one of the arguments for addressing those issues is it may be impeding our economic development efforts. One wonders if education becomes the third on that list of three or even goes up higher. Right?
It was my experience in Fort Worth. Again, to go back to my chairmanship of the Economic Development Committee, we would bring companies in. I have a distinct memory of trying to get Boeing when they were making a decision about where their corporate headquarter relocation would be. And our roads, they took a helicopter flight and wanted to kind of see what was going on. And they saw I-35 in peak congestion, and they said, no thanks.
Yeah, it's a big bummer, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But they also wanted to know about our schools, and they looked very closely at the rankings of our schools and the performance of our students, and good companies who care about the quality of life that they're going to transplant their workers into care about things like that. And if we want to continue to compete in the country's economy and in the global economy, we're going to need to make sure we can deliver the kind of quality of life, both transportation to move goods, and obviously, because we don't want to all go insane, stuck in traffic on a freeway, water infrastructure to support our economic development, and a good education system. All of those things are absolutely essential to keeping Texas in the prominent place in the economy that it is today.